Welcome to the second Lunch and Learn presentation in our Criminal Justice Reform series, Police, Justice, and Community. Last month, we heard about policing the police. Today, we're widening our scope to the study of this institution. If you're new here, a bit about us. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan voter education organization encouraging informed, active participation in government. We believe that voting is a fundamental citizen right that must be guaranteed. While the League does not support candidates or parties, we do take positions on issues we have studied. Our programs will not necessarily represent these positions, but provide forums to increase understanding of public policy issues. To quote Alex S. Vitale in his 2017 New Inquiry Journal article, The Myth of Liberal Policing, reformers have focused on improving the professionalism of police in an effort to reduce bias and unlawful behavior, rather than questioning the justness of what police are asked to do. Why are the police waging a war on drugs, war on crime, war on disorder, a war on terror? Are they really the best, most just way for the state to address these issues? Why indeed? How did their role develop historically? The history of policing, which goes back only 150 years as we know it, has problematic roots in 18th century slavery, colonialism, and the property class's view that they needed protection from those without property. In the 19th century, this was especially true as industrialized workers began to organize and make demands on factory owners. In the US, the precursors of modern police departments were often created specifically to catch slaves, to suppress workers' movements, or to carry out vigilante raids on native populations, such as the Texas Rangers did. How do we change this model? It begins with understanding it. Anthropology offers one avenue to understanding and studying insular police culture. As stated in the introduction to the volume, The Anthropology Police, edited by today's speaker, Dr. Kevin Karpiak, this field enables a reassessment of police violence relationship with a broad consideration of the human stakes at the center. Dr. Karpiak is a founder of the discipline of anthropological study of police, and currently a professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology and Criminology at Eastern Michigan University. Among his roles and accomplishments, his many roles and accomplishments, he is also director of the Southeastern Michigan Criminal Justice Policy Research Project, or SMART, and co-editor of the Cornell University Press monograph series, Police Worlds, Studies in Security, Crime, and Governance. He received his PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of California at Berkeley in 2009, for which he conducted a multi-sited ethnography of French community policing reform. Since 2016, he has been conducting research on police oversight commissions in Washtenaw County, Michigan, and currently serves on the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office's 21st Century Policing Compliance Commission. And I would like to just mention that we will post links to some of the things I've just mentioned in the chat. And so, Dr. Karpiak, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I didn't know that was coming, but that was amazing. Thank you. Made me sound maybe better and smarter than I am, but I'm happy to be here. Shelley did some of the work already that I was going to do, just introducing myself. I'm currently a professor at EMU in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology. I teach mostly in the criminology part of that department, although we like to mix, even though all of my training is in cultural anthropology. I'm kind of a cultural anthropologist that ended up studying police, which at the time that I did it was a little bit of a novelty. It's a lot more common now than it used to be. But I think that pathway for me has really allowed me kind of a different way into thinking about police and to ask questions about police that I want to talk a little bit about today, because I think they might, add to the larger conversation that the League is hoping to kind of foster on thinking about criminal justice and things like that this season. So one of the things I like to emphasize, especially my broader kind of lecture courses for undergrads in policing, most of whom my students are not anthropologists, are usually criminology students wanting to be in some way invested in policing or the criminal justice system, is to really give them a sense of the scope of human history and policing's place in it. So if you start there, human beings like you and I, biologically the same, that we could plop down next to us, and raise as our own, have been around for about 300,000 years. That's an immense time frame. If you think places like Jericho, which were had big civic works projects, are 10,000 years old. Places like Çatalhöyük in kind of southern Turkey, which was a big urban settlement of bigger than, for example, Chelsea or Selene. It was over 10,000 people living together for thousands of years. Even places like ancient Athens, home of all the great founders of thinking about democracy and reason, was 2,000 years ago. None of these places had police. Police, as we understand it today, is about, as Shelley said, about 200, maybe 300 years old, depending on where you put the origin. So human beings have been around for 300,000 years. 299,700 of them, they've lived sometimes in huge urban settlements with different classes, different ethnic groups, different political positions, with democratic decision-making sometimes, without police, which is something that is hard to wrap your head around, actually, today. In part because of something that some scholars of police have called police fetishism, which is the idea that we kind of all have, I think, ingrained in us a little bit. It's the sense that policing is an absolutely necessary part of our contemporary life, right? As Robert Reiner kind of put it, it's the ideological assumption that the police are a prerequisite of social order, so that without a police force, chaos would ensue, right? Or, as my colleague Will Garriott says, that police are so commonplace today that it's often difficult not to see their development as somehow inevitable, as the product of some social or political destiny. And what's important about naming this police fetishism is that it really serves a challenge for those of us who want to study police and ask questions about police. Not necessarily even take political positions about police, but just think about police. This police fetishism really serves as a challenge, kind of the primary challenge, the first step challenge, to really kind of think beyond. It serves a particular challenge to thinking about police. It's the scholar Michael Ignatieff says it's thinking about police requires a certain kind of mental struggle against one's own sense of the social necessity of it. And so I really would like to start a little bit there, to go over just a little bit where this sense of inevitability, where the centrality of policing in our way of thinking about the world came from a little bit, before then going on to suggesting ways that we might think creatively or anew about that relationship. So in part, I think the centrality of police as necessary for the creation of our contemporary social order if that makes any sense, has itself a long history that even predates the police as an institution as we know it today. And it has to do with the idea that social order itself emerges from a strong central sovereign, king, or an authority figure of some sort. That without a central authority figure, that there would be no reason to follow laws or social rules. So that really social order and peace and happiness requires a social figure. That again, I don't want to get into the long history of that thought. One of the classic people to go for that is Thomas Hobbes, but he's not the only one. But I bring that up if only because, again, my own academic education comes through cultural anthropology. And in a real sense, the foundation of cultural anthropology is an academic discipline, which is itself is pretty recent, early 20th century, really, late 19th, early 20th century. In a real sense, cultural anthropology, especially political anthropology, kind of the cultural anthropological study of politics and political formations, really emerged as a way to kind of counteract or rebut this idea of the necessity of a central sovereign for the proper working of social life. And in part, it did so by just kind of responding to a perplexity that kind of Europeans had as they kind of expanded across the world in their kind of colonial enterprises. They brought with them the idea that this kind of central authority figure was absolutely necessary for the proper order of things. But yet they were completely perplexed when they found that many of the people and places that they came into contact with didn't have a central sovereign like that, didn't have a central king often, didn't have police forces, didn't have jails, didn't have judges, didn't have written rule books or codes of law. And that was a real kind of perplexity for people. And there was kind of one of two responses possible to that perplexity. One was that they didn't have it because they didn't know any better, and that they were savages and animals. The other was, I think, what early cultural anthropology really tried to emphasize. You know, I'm thinking especially of the work of people like the Polish English ethnographer Bronislaw Malinowski, who did his research in a place called the Trobriand Islands, which is in kind of the south Western Pacific, and really found that, again, in a place like that, there were no central authority figures, right? There was no written code book. There was not possible to violate laws in the sense that we understand it, but yet there was a certain pattern to everyday social life. There were expectations. There were shared views of the world and shared behaviors. And the question was, how was that possible? And in his answer, and what he showed through his kind of description of everyday life among the Trobriand Islanders, was that a large part of that social order, of that kind of regulating and patterning of our collective lives, was not vertical. There was no need for a vertical sense of that. It was really lateral. It was through a series of what he called informal social control mechanisms, kinds of things that we do to each other all the time that help shape each other's behaviors. So, and the examples of those could be something as easily as like gentle teasing each other. And when you tease someone else, you're trying to shape their behavior. And it could escalate to mocking or ridicule, right? It could be through things like losing prestige. It could be through there's lots of actually anthropological descriptions of how sorcery it works in these ways as social control mechanisms. But it can also be kind of wrapped up in one's personal sense of who they are, right? That there's not necessarily the need for an external sovereign, but it can be wrapped up in kind of certain kinds of ideas of the self and certain ideas of what certain kinds of relationships are like. Right, so that once Malinowski could see it amongst the Trobriand Islanders, it became actually very clear that these same kinds of mechanisms operate not just amongst the Trobriand Islanders, but amongst places with central authorities, places with police forces, places with prisons and law books also use these social control mechanisms mainly in the most common way to produce the order that they exhibit. So that, for example, no one made me come here today to give this lecture. Right? I'm here because I want to, and it's because it's wrapped up in my sense of who I am and what I want to do and the kind of relationships I want to have. Right? No one made any of you come here, as far as I understand. But again, every time the league has one of these, people show up, right? When I walk into a room, no one tells me not to walk on my hands upside down. I walk in a certain kind of way because of my sense of expectations for how something like that works. Those kinds of mechanisms are taught. And they're not necessarily taught in a vertical way, they're taught in a lateral way. And actually, most of our social lives are produced in that way, is what anthropologists have found through the last 100+ years of thinking about kind of social order and its reproduction. Now, which raises the question, to go back to our original question, why then this police fetishism? Why then, if actually the majority of our social existence doesn't require this kind of central authority or a police force, why in our imaginations has it become so central? And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. We'll see how much. I hope I don't get too into the weeds on it. I do want to explore that today. But in summary, I'm going to suggest that it's become so central for kind of three related reasons, in that it's become central to our ideas about what political life and governance is. It's become central to our very ideas about what human nature is and how we should act upon it through governance. And it's also become central to some of our central values for how we think about freedom, nonviolence, even human rights, are really in ways that are maybe surprising, wrapped up with the development of police as both a way of thinking about governance and as an institution that kind of reproduces itself over generations. So I want to explore that a little bit today in our talk. So I said that for 299,700 years, roughly, I'm not very good at math, that human beings live together without something called police. The word police started circulating as a way to think about politics and governance and administration in kind of the 1500s and 1600s. But the real first professional police officer, the person whose job it was to do police, was actually this guy. His name was Gabriel Nicolas de Lorraine, who was the first lieutenant of police of Paris, appointed by Louis XIV in 1667. And so he was called the lieutenant de police at Paris, but I'm not sure it actually makes a lot of sense to call him a police officer in the sense that we know it today. One, he was kind of the only one. I mean, he had kind of teams of people that he would kind of send out to do things, but what he was imagined as being responsible for was something a lot broader than what we think of today when we talk about police. Police in the 16th and 17th century, even up through the 18th century, in kind of political thought, in governance, in kind of political philosophy, had a much different, broader meaning. So it meant something, it didn't mean a kind of institution with guys in uniforms with guns that could put you in jail. It meant something much more akin to something like good governance. It even had an aesthetic quality, so that you could go to a city and talk about its beautiful police. It meant well run, it meant well managed, and it meant, beautiful, right? So that, for example, some historians of police point out all the kind of broad things that Lorraine was responsible for in his role of lieutenant of police. It was security, for sure, and it was actually illicit bearing of arms was one of the key reasons for the establishment of police. As we're still dealing with things like gun control, the original police department was set up due to bourgeois concerns over the increasing prevalence of firearms, actually, and fights over firearms. But he also was responsible for sanitation work, cleaning the streets, the lights. He was responsible for the fire department and for flood emergency evacuation. He was responsible for assuring the food supplies and assuring food prices, making sure baguettes were there, or they weren't baguettes actually, but bread was the appropriate, was not being charged too much so that people could afford it and that there wouldn't be kind of bread riots. He was in charge of regulating stocks and stock prices. He was in charge of the hostels. He was in charge of the hotels. He was in charge of establishing weights and measures of book selling and publishing. He was in charge of regulating morals and religion. He was in charge of things like what we would call public health today. It was a much broader version of police than what we think of when we think about police today. So much so that, in my mind, I'm not sure I would call him police in the sense that we mean it today. Like he has as much in common with, for example, things like public health or city administration or public administration today as police per se. But one thing that did emerge with this around the same time as kind of the establishment of the Lieutenancy de Police of Paris was a new way of thinking about what government was and how it should do its work. And here I'm relying in large part on a kind of a historian and philosopher called Michel Foucault. But the argument goes that kind of in the wake of the medieval justification for governance had to do with kind of the greater glorification of the church and of God. But in the early 15th, 16th, 17th century, there kind of was a demand for a different way of thinking about the purpose of government. What was the reason for government? What was the raison d'etat? Was the reason of state? There's a huge kind of set of kind of political tracts about that, including Machiavelli is one of the famous kind of thinkers about that. And what they were searching for was really a justification for why is there government, right? And can we justify it through secular terms, not necessarily through metaphysical terms? And what they were really searching for was a way to kind of justify political power outside of just sheer kind of will to power, outside of just sheer might makes right. What is the larger good that governance is going for? And can we explain it in terms of secular goals? And really, people like Lorraine and Louis XIV, through him and his minister Colbert, who kind of established the post, were really kind of drawing from this kind of political philosophy of police. in the larger sense, it said the goal of government should be fostering the general well-being and health of its people. Right? And that's what the original sense of police meant for them, right? And so in addition to that kind of different goal, a larger goal, there was also a different kind of way of kind of thinking about governance through the police, right? And Foucault's example of this, interestingly, both kind of, he gives a couple examples, both kind of predating and postdating the actual establishment of the lieutenancy of police. But one of his examples actually is very relevant to today. It had to do with thinking about vaccines as a way of governing disease, right? Versus other kinds of ways of thinking about disease. Where if, for example, one traditional way of thinking about disease and contamination was to try to keep the disease out. Think of your kind of biblical leper colonies, or even your quarantine in the original sense, where you had to stay outside the city for 40 days, right? The idea was the way to regulate disease was to make sure that disease doesn't enter your city or your political body. Keep it out, keep the bad things out, and keep the inside pure, right? So Foucault argues that in addition to that strategy, which never really went away, and we still see it in a lot of different ways today, but in addition to that, there was a new way of thinking about, a new strategy, a new playbook for how to govern disease, which was what he calls security, actually. But you could see it in, for example, in the development of vaccines, where vaccines don't operate by trying to keep the disease out of bodies. They actually put the disease into bodies, but in a regulated way, in a managed way, in small amounts that then the body's immune system can react to it and then prevent larger outbreaks and spreads of disease. So it's a way of really thinking about the objects that one governs in a different kind of way in order to foster its health, right? So this is where I could potentially get into the weeds a little bit. So I might try and decide how much I want to get in the weeds and how much I want to skip. I want to suggest a little bit that that way of thinking about policing, that way of thinking about governance, has its parallels in a lot of different ways of thinking about creation, or even human activity, right? And then you could even see a parallel, for example, in art, and how we think about an artist and a painter. So if you think about the classic vision of a grand artiste, the grand painter is kind of captured in this painting here, where kind of there's a master and there's a canvas, and everything on that canvas is the direct expression of that central sovereign's will. That shade, that paint blot, that arrangement of figures is all the result of one central vision. And that's usually that's a classic way of thinking about art, right? And how one kind of manages a canvas. But it's not the only way of thinking about art, right? There's other ways of thinking about art. You know, here I have an example of kind of an Andy Warhol painting, right? That is a different way of thinking about creation and a canvas. Whereas Andy Warhol didn't take this picture of Marilyn Monroe. Andy Warhol didn't even necessarily even do the screening, the ink screening that colored her at all, right? It's taking pre-existing kinds of elements, right, and pre-existing social relations, and not necessarily removing any of them or having complete control over them, but modulating them, rearranging them in ways to create something new and beautiful. Another way of thinking about the same thing is, you see I've taken some of these slides from my own lectures when I look about this, is to think about, again, how one makes use of space. So that kind of classic painting way, that kind of leper colony way of thinking about how to regulate disease, you know, we could also think about how, for example, a police officer might regulate urban space, right? And that classic way, Foucault called it kind of disciplinary apparatus, right? And in that kind of way of regulating space or creating beauty, right? What the sovereign does, or what the delegate of the sovereign does, is it's always vigilant to make sure the things that are on the canvas are what were pre-approved, are what were part of the vision, and are appropriate. And if the things are not appropriate, the action is to seize it and remove it, and either to reform it, to reshape it back into what it should be, or to eliminate it, right? So in policing, that means this is out of place. I'm going to grab it and take it in until we can figure out what to do with it, right? Which is a strategy that exists and has existed for a long time. But along with kind of policing as we understand it today, was not just that strategy. It was also something Foucault called security, which is again, just like the painting version, is a different way of thinking about how to use that space. And instead of kind of pre-approving the things in the space, what it does is it pays attention to what is in that space already. It assumes a pre-existing space, right? And it wants to know about what the things are in that space and how they act, what their tendencies are. And it makes use of that knowledge in order to then plan interventions, often of a preventative nature, right? So on this space, thinking about this space, Mr. Triangle goes left and right. Mr. Square goes around in a circle. Mr. Circle goes up and down, as I try and make them. So they have tendencies and vectors and patterns. And the job of police is to understand the things on that canvas and then be able to intervene in order to avoid certain kinds of outcomes. So if our goal is to avoid Mr. Square or Mr. Triangle and Mr. Circle to kind of clash, right? We have to understand what their patterns are, what their tendencies are, what their vectors are, and then we can intervene, not necessarily to remove Mr. Triangle from the canvas, or even make Mr. Triangle the kind of thing that goes left and right, to try to change that very nature, right? What you do is you modulate it. Maybe you build a wall between them. Maybe you find some other kinds of way to avoid their interaction, right? Maybe you try to lessen one or the other. That is a way to think about security and governance. And again, it's not just police. You can think about it in economics. You could think about it again in public health. You can think about it in all different kinds of ways. And that's a little bit Foucault's point here, is that this is a broader way of thinking about governance that police kind of comes out of. But there's a couple of important points about it that I want to emphasize that are absolutely necessary to the creation of what we think of as police and why it's become so central. In order for this strategy to work, or the security strategy, which became by far the preferred strategy of using police, of using governance and intervention, you have to know what those things are. So you have to know what the kinds of objects on your canvas are, and you have to know what their nature is, that is how they act, what their tendencies, what their desires are, right? So you actually need a certain kind of knowledge, a certain kind of expertise. And in fact, one could argue, and when people do argue and have argued, that actually the birth of the social sciences, or the human sciences even, actually emerged from this demand of this strategy of power. In order to act appropriately or do this effectively as a strategy of power, you have to know what Mr. Triangle is. Mr. Triangle could be criminals. How do criminals act? What is a criminal? What are their tendencies, right? What are, how do they interact with public space? How do they interact with kind of the marketplace in town, right? What are the tendencies of the marketplace? When is it busy? When is it not, right? How do we make sure that those don't interact? You need someone called a criminologist who understands a criminal. You need someone called an economist to understand the workings of the economy. And then you base your governance on that kind of expertise. Now, that in the biggest sense, I think actually is where policing as we understand it emerges from, as a way of thinking about governance as a kind of mode of preventative action based on an expert analysis of the things that are in play and how they act and how they interact, right? You'll notice that, for example, versus the kind of informal control mechanisms that we talked about earlier, where they're kind of lateral and kind of people act, kind of everybody acting on each other in different kinds of ways. That strategy of governance requires a kind of special group of people, a set group of experts who have particular authority, particular legitimacy to enact governance because of their special kinds of knowledge and how to do those things. They know how to do these things better than other people, and therefore they have a special right to participate in governance versus kind of the commoners. Right? That, I think, is one of the key moves, one of the key essential elements in thinking about police. The other, and that in fact predates in large degree what we think of when we think about the creation of the police as an institution in the American and Anglo sense. Right? This is a conversation that's happening in France and on the continent, but actually is very much resisted in kind of the Anglo-American world until for a while. So that oftentimes in our history, in kind of the classic history books of policing, they kind of cite the foundation of modern police with this guy Robert Peel, who established the Metropolitan Police Force for London in 1829, the so-called bobbies, which were the first kind of professional police force, and I think in a sense that we would recognize. But what's really interesting about Peel's version of police was that he really narrowed down the version of what it claimed to be. By the time of Peel, right, we no longer had this broad sense of the general well-being and the general beautiness being what police meant. It really was the modern sense of a specific organization of uniformed paramilitary dudes whose job was specifically to provide that well-being and beautiness, but not through regulating stock prices, not through preventing fires necessarily, or assuring the price of bread, which kind of got splintered off into other kinds of professions. Police were the profession that said they could provide that well-being through basically urban pacification, right? Through something they called crime control and prevention, by which they meant in practice kind of the pacification of the newly kind of burgeoning urban populations. That by controlling those people through something called crime control and prevention, they could provide for the general happiness and well-being. Now, it's really important to understand that before he created the bobbies, Robert Peel was in charge of the colonial enterprise in Ireland. He was a director of the colonial enterprise in Ireland, and in the occupation and pacification of Irish resistance. And in fact, what he tried to do with the bobbies was to have a parallel kind of force that he could then bring to London and the English territories properly, to which the English had been traditionally very, very kind of resistant to any idea of a police. They thought of, again, as this, there's all kinds of great historical quotes about the dirty French and their police, that it was really considered very non-English, right? Up until right around the time, maybe even just before the right? All right. So That was a creation of Hobbes. Yeah. So, and the parallelisms were very explicit. The blue of the Bobby's coats that we still associate with police officers were chosen as a direct contrast to the red coats of the British military forces. It was seen as a way of expressing the similarity, but also categorical difference. That these were not going to be an occupying force. These were something that were going to be something for the public good and responsive to the public, and not, and again, importantly in the beginning, not armed in the same way as a military force, but still using some of the same techniques of pacification to establish a general sense of good. The good is what the original police force was kind of imagined as. Now in the U.S. context, drew largely on this Anglo version of policing, but along with the kind of forms of social inequality and the reinforcement of social hierarchies that came from the British experience, the American experience was used to enforce the same kind of, or it was used as well to exist the kinds of social hierarchies that existed here, which is why a third kind of tradition that merges into the American style of policing is, again, this kind of long history of kind of anti-Black policing, and thinking about specifically the people that it polices as a kind of property and as a kind of valuing it in terms of its economic productivity. Yeah. So that's the development of police as we know it in a nutshell. Hopefully I didn't go too fast or too long there, but it raises the question, given especially those last two slides, its connection with, from its foundation with kind of importing a model of colonial domination and of racial domination into kind of the everyday governance of our social lives. What in our title is, policing, community, and justice. What does policing have to do with actually either of those two terms, but especially justice? And so that's a good question. I asked it myself. The answer, I think, getting towards the answer, I think, is one person that helps get towards that answer is someone called Max Weber, who a lot of, especially the scholars of policing, especially the earliest scholars of policing, sociologists of policing, really relied on. And so one kind of formulation that Weber had when thinking about kind of this question of what is the modern political form known as the state? What is government, and what makes it legitimate? What is the basis of its legitimacy? He kind of suggested this formula, which is, he suggested that the one way to think about the state is it's that human community which claims the monopoly of legitimate force over a given territory. Right? So it's a human community which says which makes the claim that we have or should have the monopoly, the sole right to do legitimate force over a special territory. Right? Now for Weber, this was really a formula. It was all these pieces had to go together: human plus community plus claims to it, the monopoly, the legitimacy, the force. All those had to go together, and all of those were tricky terms. I'm going to be interested in the forms of community in a second, and exploring the forms of community that go into thinking about police. Weber himself was actually mostly interested in thinking about the forms of legitimacy that went into the kinds of things that police do, the kind of the state in general, and as a kind of the delegate of state power, the police do. And one thing that he said, that the legitimate state action in this modern form has to kind of jump two ethical hurdles, or it has to respond to two ethical challenges, is maybe a better way of saying it. One he called the ethic of responsibility, which is the idea that one must be accountable for the foreseeable results of one's actions. So the ethic of responsibility suggests that in order to be legitimate, for in that formula, in order for it to be proper state action, it has to be legitimate. In order for it to be legitimate, the person doing it or the body doing it has to be accountable for the foreseeable results of their actions. So they have to show that they thought through what was going to happen based on the course of action that they chose, right? And then be accountable to that course. Right? The other kind of hurdle, which it was a very different one, what she called the ethic of ultimate ends, was that one must also be accountable for one's guiding values. And not just kind of the means to how I got to my goal, but you also have to be accountable for the goal itself. What was the goal here? What is your overall goal as an organization? What are you trying to achieve? Right? And you have to be able to account for that as well. So both these, goal, means, and ends have to be accounted for in order for any kind of action to be legitimate. Right? So you can think of the ethic of responsibility as justifying how you do it or how you get there. Do you take the bus or the motorcycle? Do you do traffic stops, or do you do traffic stops in person, or do you video surveillance? Right? What is your means? What is your tool? Right? But the tools, the means in themselves are not an adequate legitimation. You have to do both the means and the goals. So what is the goal here? What are you trying to accomplish? And then to return, are the means that you're using appropriate to achieve that goal? Right? So that whole conversation for Weber is what needs to happen in order for something like police to be just. Now, I know that's a little abstract. So what does that mean when thinking about, for example, contemporary policing and the role community could play in policing? So what role does community play in thinking about police and justice? I want to give just one quick example of what that can mean. So there's in kind of classic intro to criminology kind of conversations. One thing you learn very quickly in studies of police is that, especially in the US today, but even increasingly throughout the world, police always claim to be doing community policing. It's a very popular thing to say, we're doing community policing. Everyone likes to say they're doing it. But what that means in practice, and also in conception, can be very, very different. And here I'm relying a lot, it's on the bottom of the screen here, on a scholar named Stephen Herbert, who's kind of broken down different ways of thinking about what community policing means. One version he calls something called broken windows policing, and one he wants to kind of assert is this is what community policing really should mean. And so he kind of breaks down the broken windows policing and community policing. But the point is actually both of these two styles on the screen here often go under the name community policing. But they're actually really importantly different, not just in terms of what police do on the street, but even more importantly, for how they envision the role of community in policing and how they assess the ultimate justice of what police action is. Okay? So that, for example, this kind of broken windows policing, this community policing that goes by broken windows policing, and you hear this a lot, like we're doing community policing, and the proof is that we're always out in the community, and we're out on foot, and so that's community policing, right? But just being out in the community is not necessarily community policing. That's policing, right? And if you're doing it in a certain kind of way, it's very different from what Steve Herbert wants to call community policing. For example, broken windows policing, this idea that the job of police is to be out in the community, out on foot, and paying attention to kind of the little details of disorder, the broken windows of buildings, sometimes literally, but also the other signs of urban disorder that kind of cause people to feel unsafe and unsettled in their environment, that's what police should be focusing on, right? And that's what community policing means. That style of policing, good or bad, one could be the judge, but it imagines the role of the community in a certain kind of way, and it imagines the police in a certain kind of way. In that version, the community stands in maybe for setting the goals or the ultimate values or the standards, right? So that in that vision, kind of the community doesn't like these kinds of people on the corner. And so, or people get unsettled when there's people around the corner. And so our job is to get rid of them, right? So it maybe has a role for thinking of incorporating community in maybe setting some of the values, but the active role of setting police tactics, of setting police administration, of doing police work is still the sole priority of that human community called the police, right? The police guard that mandate for themselves. The work of policing, the day-to-day means by which we do it, right? And the short-term goals to achieve the large-term goal maybe are all set by police. Community doesn't have an active role to play besides having a set of values. Whereas for Herbert, that's unfortunate because he sees real community policing as being about the co-production of policing strategies, to really expand in that formula of that human community which claims a monopoly of legitimate violence or force over territory, to that word community should not just incorporate uniformed police officers, but should be community, right? And that communities should co-produce police strategies, right? So that in what Herbert says, true policing strategies, the police and citizenry are co-equal partners in the construction and evaluation of tactics aimed at ameliorating community distress. That the citizenry are not just kind of there to kind of be informed of what police are doing, and because the police are the experts on these things, but that the citizenry are actively involved in setting the goals and tactics, and are imagined as experts in policing on a co-equal level in the process, right? And for Herbert, that's both a very different incorporation into policing of what community might mean, and it's also a really different version of what justice looks like. Because if in the former, the broken windows policing, the goal is to remove the kinds of things that don't belong there and are causing problems, to get rid or to fix the broken windows, right? Where it's very clear who the problems are and who the good guys are, and we just need to get rid of the problems. In real co-production, those lines get blurrier. It's not about who's the good guys and the bad guys, right? In fact, there's an argument that precisely those people that have been most policed, precisely those people that have most been affected by policing, including the formerly incarcerated and over-policed, have an important role to play in setting the priorities of police. Something that police departments have a real hard time thinking about. And so Herbert emphasizes that even though everyone says they're doing community policing, almost exclusively what they're doing is broken windows policing. This community policing, in the sense that he means it, is really hard for police officers in police departments to really swallow, and even for the broader community to really wrap their head around. In large part, he argues, and I think I follow him, because of these ingrained assumptions about how policing, governance, and kind of liberty are necessarily connected. We have a sense that they're necessarily connected in a certain kind of way. Again, this kind of sense of police fetishism. And just to close a little bit, to me, that's why, for me, an anthropology of police, which tries to think about how policing works in the larger human context, both I gave kind of the historical context of the 300,000 years, but also across different kinds of national traditions. So here are a couple of books that I'm really fond of. Farhana Ibrahim's From Family to Police Force, Jeff Martin's Sentiment, Reason and Law, Mirko Goffers' Policing the Frontier, all of which are exploring policing in different contexts. And in a way that maybe we could get through some of the chat, but I unfortunately have a lot of time here to talk about, I think are really helpful when we understand how policing works in different kinds of contexts. That necessary relationship between policing, community, and what a just outcome looks like is really shattered. They no longer seem necessarily related in the same kind of way, which I think, and I hope, actually opens the door for thinking creatively about new ways, new constellations of how to create those relationships.
There are so many questions, and some of the ones that I had prepared, I'm not sure how to phrase them to kind of fit into that. I think that one of the things for me was that thinking that you're studying the police and how you actually do that, because I know that, like, around the Sheriff Clayton's, what was 21st Century Policing Committee and stuff like that. And so as part of that, what are some of the ethical questions that come up when you're an anthropologist studying police? Like, if you do field work, and you're with the police, and there's an incident where you witness police brutality or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about that sort of thing and in the context of a study?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen just 1 second, because the answer I'm going to give is from one of the people on the last slide.
Okay.
So Beatrice Jaregui, that middle book, called Provisional Authority. It's about police officers in kind of northwest India. Mm-hmm. And one of her kind of general points in the book is to get us to understand how not centrally authoritative they are in that context. That, like, it's very hard to even get a uniform, right? Let alone to actually have any actual authority over many people, right? In that context, right? What instead they have what she calls this provisional authority, which is much more reliant on kind of on a set of social relationships and never completely established, and also always contingent. Right? That's how policing kind of functions in that. But in the course of doing that work, she came up with something called what she called dirty anthropology, which is, I said that until B, who is a good friend of mine, and I are basically kind of the same generation of anthropologists. But before us, it was very rare for cultural anthropologists, especially in the US, to study police. Like when I say rare, it didn't happen. Right? There was nobody, right? And in fact, a lot of my early work is really trying to work through why, right? And in part because exactly the dynamic that you raised was really difficult for how anthropologists thought about who they were and what their work was. Especially since the late 60s, 70s, 80s have been really kind of, they wanted to be political. They wanted to be social advocates of kind of progressive visions of kind of racial and economic equality. And so they felt much more comfortable studying the people affected by police than police themselves, right? Because you can't empathize and feel good about the people you're studying in the same way when you're studying police, right? So because you see them do not great things, right? You have to have this weird relationship where in order to learn about them, you actually have to develop relationships with them as people, right? Because our method is to really something called participant observation, where our method, instead of doing surveys or lab experiments, our actual method of learning in cultural anthropology is to go live with people and learn from them and directly, right? So that for my, fieldwork in France, I lived at a police academy, and I was in France for about 3 years, right? And you build these personal relationships with people, and you get to understand them as people, but you also you see them do these things, right? And you understand the larger implications. And so it requires a different way of, I think, thinking about what the role of a researcher is and what our obligations to the people that we study are, and the people that we are not necessarily studying are. I don't know if I have the final answer, but I know that, for example, in my work, and I'm doing a lot of things around Washtenaw lately, but in my work on the 21st century policing or compliance thing of Sheriff Clayton, I'm interested in it. And part about why I'm willing to give my time is because I do think of it as a potential way to rethink how a broader community could be invested and have authority over, for example, setting the policies in a real concrete way of a police force, like the sheriff's office, Washtenaw County, right? Like I do see potential there. I still do, even though we've been doing it for a while, and I'm not sure what we have to show for it yet. So I still see that potential. Although I also do see, and I'm often sometimes critical, that there's still some of these dynamics working at play, even in the best of police, right? This defense of the central mandate, this defense that we're the right people to do this defense that this kind of a real reluctance to rethink the fundamental dynamics of policing are in play. And I think it's important to kind of point those out and show them when they're in play.
So have you ever actually shadowed, like here in Washtenaw County? I mean, you mentioned you lived with the French police, but here in Washtenaw County,
I've done it a little bit. So I did my original dissertation work in France, and then for that I did some of that, but I actually was mostly interested in not the guys on the street. I was actually interested in the administrators and how they made decisions about like how to set the syllabus for the police academy, how to do the evaluations for who to hire or not, or who to give raises for. So I was kind of interested in that. So even in my initial dissertation research, I didn't do a whole ton of it. Lots of people do. In fact, there's another book, a pretty famous book that happened at the same time as I was doing mine, by an anthropologist, Didier Fassin, called The Forces of Order, or I believe is the name of it. Maybe I'm thinking of the French title. And he did the ride-alongs and was on the street with them. But I've always been interested in kind of what happens in the offices a little bit. And so I've done a little bit of that here in Washtenaw as I've shifted my research focus to that. But I end up still kind of really be interested in not that I don't think it's important or that important things happen on the street, but I think we overlook a lot of how much policing happens in the offices. Right? And so I'm oftentimes interested in the administration of police. And so that's why I get interested in things like the 21st Century Commission or the police oversight commissions around, as another kind of way of rethinking how communities can be involved in police administration in a different kind of way, rather than just uniform police being kind of responsible for police administration. How can we rethink the role of communities in police administration itself? And that's kind of where my focus has been. Yeah.
So if we wanted to have people who are studying the police, actually accompanying them in their work, I mean, is that something that's, they're supposed to wear these body cams, but you never know when they're going to turn them off or on or whatever. And it seems like a kind of a risky thing for a civilian to be following around the police that we have right now.
I will say there's actually a lot of it. Like there's been a lot of it. I mean, not necessarily here specifically in Washtenaw County, but I would say actually most of the studies of policing are based on doing that.
Okay.
So I could maybe, without being pedantic, I give a bibliography, but I would say even one thing maybe I overemphasized or didn't make clear. When I say anthropologists haven't done a lot of this work, sociologists actually have.
Okay.
Since at least the late 60s and 70s.
Okay.
And for the most part, most of that work since the 60s and 70s has been based on a similar kind of participant observation, ride-alongs with police and observing. And so that book by Didier Fassin that I mentioned is one of them. There's a lot, Stephen Herbert, who I also mentioned, did some of that kind of work. The other books I actually mentioned were all doing similar work like that, where they were kind of embedded with police. And there's others as well. So it happens a lot. So it's very, very common as a way to think about kind of getting a kind of an unfiltered view of what police do is at least the goal there. How unfiltered whenever is in those situations is another question. But there's a lot of that work, and I'm happy to point to some of it as well. But you're right, it does raise those kind of questions of danger and what can one actually talk about, and are you violating people's privacy by talking about X, Y, or Z? Are you actually getting access, or are they just giving you? Are they not taking you to the places where things really happen?
Right.
All those kinds of things are things people have kind of tried to struggle through a little bit in this. A good book, and again, forgive me for keep on recommending books, but there's an edited volume called Writing Police Worlds, I believe, again by Didier Fassin, but it includes a lot of different anthropologists in that, where they kind of really go through some of what I just talked about there.
That's Writing Police Worlds?
Writing, like writing.
Yeah, writing, WRITING.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so not to belabor this point too much, because there are a few more questions, but so is there literature, or have some of these sociologists or social scientists ever reported on, yeah, I was present at a where police shot someone?
Oh yeah. Watching evidence of police violence, yeah, absolutely. One of the classic ones is a work from a guy, William Chambliss. It's an article called "Policing the Ghetto," where he does that. Again, Didier Fassin's book, just off the top of my head, has instances of that as well, where he watches incidents of like police violence. And for sure, in my own work, I haven't written about it necessarily very much, but I saw it, and you have to grapple with it,
yeah,
and what it means, and how to write about it. There's lots of things actually that some things I know I can never write about, but yeah.
I'm just curious, have you ever heard of a lawyer named T. Greg Doucette?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, it might be of interest. I follow him on Twitter. He has compiled this whole thread, this enormous Twitter thread of video recordings of police violence, like taken by observers. And it seemed to me like that would be like a very fertile field of exploration. I wonder if anybody is, because all he's doing basically is he's saying, here I'm reporting on, these issues. I'm passing on these recordings of police violence, and some of it is just like unwatchable. I mean, it's amazing. But anyway, I wonder if anybody's kind of like looking at that.
No, there's a couple different ways one can go there, right? And so there's one set of questions from the social science perspective, there's a set of questions about how prevalent is it? How many of these incidents are there, right? Like how much does this actually happen? Are these anecdotes? Or is this persistent? Right? There's the questions about why it happens. That first question, how many in terms of number happen? I actually don't think anthropologists will ever be very good at that. That's where you need a sociologist or a political scientist or something like that. They're better with those big numbers, right? And kind of counting things. And cultural anthropologists tend not to be very good with numbers, and their method is not really good. Like when you're hanging out with a person, right? Or even 10 people or 50 people, you know, how many you can hang out with at a time. It's never going to be as much as a survey could do, right? You're never going to have that broad quantitative necessarily perspective on that. What you can focus on is like what happened in that incident, what went together, right? How were, you know, what happened beforehand, what happened afterwards, what were they thinking of before or after, what did they say? You know, you could focus on the concrete instance of it, right? And really understanding how it all came together. And that's what I think, yeah, that's what that's what the kind of people I was talking about there are better at. Although there's definitely that literature out there trying to kind of assess the prevalence of it as well. There's also a literature on kind of assessing what to do with those videos. Right?
Yeah, that's
because again, one answer of how prevalent it is it seems more prevalent now, but it's most likely because we see it more. And that there's no evidence that these kinds of violent incidents are in any way happening more.
Right.
We're seeing it more.
Yeah.
Right? And so what that means, for the possibilities of political action, you know, like the possibilities for how we think about police, are something that a lot of people who've given a lot more thought to it than I have written about. One of my favorite is an anthropologist called Meg Stalcup, who has done some stuff on police videos, but also body cams and what kind of video evidence means. But there's other people. I think I've gotten one directly to me. I'm not sure if
okay.
I'm happy to answer it though. So somebody asked what I think about groups like the Washtenaw Citizens Police Academy. Are these academies geared to create empathy for police tactics rather than encourage community participation in policing? Is this the wrong approach? Short answer, yeah, I do think. I mean, I've never done the sheriff's, the Washtenaw County, so I can't speak directly. I did the Ann Arbor one. I took it to learn what they're saying and seeing, but my experience was about the message always is we know what we're doing. Here's our expertise. Be comfortable, and as long as we show you what we're doing, we're not really asking you what we should do. We're telling you what we do and explaining why it's right.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, again, a different dynamic necessarily than, for example, what Steve Herbert thinks about when he talks about co-production.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I did take some years back, I took the Sheriff Clayton's Washtenaw Citizens Police Academy, and I learned a tremendous amount. But I think you and I, when we first met, I was telling you that when I came away from it, I didn't come away with, here's now how I continue with what I've been taught. You know, it was more like, oh, now I've learned how wonderful the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department is. But there wasn't any, kind of way I could do anything with it. And then I started, like talking to friends of color who were like, well, really? That's what they were saying. But I actually do want to say that they do a lot of things that I hadn't realized. And so I did learn a lot. And, but
Sheriff Clinton is doing, especially since his re-election, is doing a lot.
Yeah.
But and so in addition to the police, what had been the kind of police academy, I'm not sure what the official name is, but he also has something, I'm not sure if it started yet, but called the Police Reform Academy, which is something very different.
Wow.
In collaboration with the Washtenaw County chapter of My Brother's Keeper. And I think, at least how he's explained it to me, is that he does see that as more of this kind of co-production model.
Another question. So this was from one of our participants who's out in Chelsea, and apparently the question is, what is the most important question to ask Chelsea City Council when they get the report of the audit of our police department?
Wow. Okay. I'm going to give an answer. I'm not sure how helpful it is. So
okay.
It's going to be a really big answer.
Okay.
To me, the question does go back to that favor, right? And it's the reason we throw so much resources, the reason we give so much to police, the reason the police are such a big part of our budget is that they make a really tremendous claim that their profession, something that their profession can do, that we can provide safety and well-being with our resources, with the resources you give us, right? And so the question for me is always, what are you doing? Like, show me that you're doing that with those resources, and that other kinds of things could not do it better, right? Show me what you mean by safety, and two, is your version is your version of safety adequate? Does safety mean that is the entirety of what safety means is there's not, car burglaries? Or does safety mean that people have a safe place to go where they have shelter and heat and food, right? That to me is safety. And it was part of the original, the big sense of police, right? The general well-being, right? So isn't an adequate notion of what they're providing? Is what they're providing actually that profound, right? And if my real goal is, sure, I don't want cars to be burglarized, but I also want children to have food. How can I, and whatever safety means to me includes that, right? How do I make sure that the resources we're giving would not be better adequately funneled to that, right? And our police, and the third part, oftentimes police want to say that they do it, right? Or they can do it. So, we're having this conversation about mental health responders in Washtenaw County and Ann Arbor, right? That police, that we want, that we're including in what safety means, that we want people's mental health to be safely handled without the danger of an armed response, right? Is part of that conversation. Ideally, we would like that, right? Some police say that they can do it, right? But the question is, for me, oftentimes, is that the adequate profession to provide that form of safety and that service? Or are there other kinds of expertise that are better attuned to it than something that's really still shaped around the pacification of urban space through crime control?
There's a good question in the chat there that I think, can you speak a bit more about how community is defined in community policing? For example, would you think that Austin, Texas citizens petitioning to criminalize homeless encampments is an example of community policing?
Well, I wouldn't want to define it, but what I would want to do is to point out that we have to ask exactly that question. That oftentimes who and what the community is in community policing is the question you have to ask. So for example, in that, I don't know very much about that case, but oftentimes the community, right? What stands in for the community is not everyone. Right. It's the well-resourced and the people that can be at the meetings and the people who make decisions about the police budget, right? And city council stand in for the community, where the unhoused, the marginalized, right, the currently incarcerated, right, the formerly incarcerated, the otherwise marginalized people, oftentimes are not thought of as the community, but as the external thing to be policed, right? And so I think we always have to think about when the word community is used in these conversations, who is this really meaning here? And what is their role in it, in policing, right? Is I think why I think the work of some of the people that I was referencing are really helpful. And then it helps us pause enough to start asking that question in these situations.
I think I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're kind of, well, maybe we have time for a couple, but let's see. Here's one that I'm not sure if this is in your bailiwick here, but the question from one of our participants came: how do you mitigate training to I guess, to not kill when using a gun? Have studies been done on shooting to halt or disarm?
Sure. And so there's a massive industry for now, especially the last couple of years, in people who claiming that they could teach you how to do nonviolent, non-lethal policing. And so you could hire any number of high-priced consultants and trainers and seminars to say that they do it. And there's also, most of it, there's no evidence that they can. There is some work going on about trying to kind of think about what kinds of factors lead to violent outcomes versus nonviolent outcomes. But even that, again, some of the terms get really tricky. In that, like, do we mean lethal when we say violent? Are tasers violent? Right? Is being ejected from Liberty Square a violent act when you have no place to go? So what do we mean when we say non-violent? Oftentimes we mean non-lethal, which is good, but again, maybe not ideal, would be what I would want to say, for one. And two, there's also a parallel industry in what de-escalation, which I found, I've yet to find a police officer that I think really understands what de-escalation means. Right? Unfortunately, more often, there was a police officer in Ann Arbor, actually, who once described de-escalation as, we could use one level of force higher than what we're being presented with.
Oh my gosh.
So if they're doing this, in order to pacify the situation, we could do one extra in order to make sure it's pacified. And that's what de-escalation means. It meant, like, we don't go 3 steps above what we have to, the appropriate use of force given the situation. It might be the guidelines for what the legal limits of appropriate force are, but that's not de-escalation.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. And I found that's a real hard thing to grapple with. Again, lots of people smarter than me are trying to work on kind of thinking about models for de-escalation, about how to implement them in police departments. But it's hard, in part because, again, police don't necessarily want to do it, and people don't necessarily want police to do it. Like, again, because of how we think about what the role of police is, well, what we think of what governance is, and what we think police have to do in order for order, they don't necessarily want police to de-escalate, right? Do we want the police officer to not chase in a car, even though they've seen a crime, right? Or does that feel wrong to us? My sense is that, there's not a consensus there.
Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of thinking it in terms of some of the presentations we've had here earlier about, restorative justice as opposed to, punitive justice, and how over the last, 5 years or so, I mean, it just seems like there are people who think that if you're impoverished or you get to steal bread because your family needed to eat or whatever, you need to be punished and you need to suffer for that. And there are people who think, wow, that's a problem. How do we give bread to that person before he commits a crime, or she commits a crime? And it's all tangled up. I think it's all tangled up. Yeah, well, we at the end of this, at the end of our time here, and I have a few announcements that I need to make, but I've just been fascinated with the history you've presented and with some of the ideas that you've, put forth here. And I thank you so much for.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad you found it interesting. I was worried about it was too much or too fast, but
it was great. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to turn to our participants and say thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us in September for the final programs in the Criminal Justice Reform Series. Brews and Views on September 8th at 7 p.m. When League member Teresa Reed will moderate a panel of 3 Washtenaw County officials: Delphia Simpson, who's the Chief Public Defender, Jerry Clayton, the Sheriff, and Sue Shink, County Commissioner for District 2. And they will be discussing what we've mentioned here today, the Washtenaw County Criminal Justice Collaborative Council. And I'll be back with you for Lunch and Learn on September 24th to talk with Mary King, who is the former director and current consultant to the Michigan Council for Youth Justice. And she will speak on stopping the prison pipeline. Also, I want to quickly give an action alert for all Washtenaw County participants. County commissioners are seeking input on how to spend nearly $100 million in recovery money that we've received from the federal government and other sources, I think. It's an opportunity to help the county focus on putting dollars where you think it's important. I'm going to put this this link to their their press release or whatever, which has links to the survey and also links to the kinds of projects they're considering. And I highly recommend that you all go out there and finish it. It's due on August 31st, so please do it by then. I'd also like to thank the current members of the League of Women Voters for your support. If you're not yet a member, consider joining the League to support the essential work of protecting the right of every citizen to vote. Check out our website, lwvwashtenaw.org. That's lwvwashtenaw.org for how to join. And there you'll also find links to videos of this and many other presentations and many other things that we are doing. So stay safe, stay well, and stay informed and active in your government.